It's 6:15. I'm calling the Town of Los Gatos special meeting of the Town Pension and OPEB Trust Oversight Committee meeting to order. Clerk, could we have the roll call, please?
Councilmember Rennie?
Here.
Councilmember Moore?
Here.
Councilmember Hudas?
Here.
Vice Mayor Badami?
Here.
Mayor Chair Risto?
Here. Thank you. And now I believe we roll our video and recording of meeting decorum. Thank you.
The public is welcome to participate at Town Council meetings, understanding that the purpose of the meetings is to conduct the important business of the town in an efficient and effective manner. At each meeting, the following expectations of civil conduct shall apply. 1. For the benefit of the entire community, the Town of Los Gatos asks that all speakers follow the town's meeting guidelines by treating everyone with respect and dignity. This is done by following meeting guidelines set forth in state law, in the town code, and on the cover sheet of the council agenda. 2. The town embraces diversity and strongly condemns hate speech and offensive hateful language or racial intolerance of any kind at council meetings. 3. Town council and staff are well aware of the public's right to disagree with their professional opinion on various town issues. However, antisocial behavior, slander, hatred, and bigotry statements are completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated in any way, shape, or form at town council meetings. 4. All public comments at the town council meeting must pertain to items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the town and shall not contain slanderous statements, hatred, and bigotry against non-public officials. 5. The town will go through the following steps if a disturbance results from a member of the public not following these rules. If participating remotely, town staff may mute the individual with an explanation for the record of why muting occurred consistent with this policy. If participating in person, the mayor may call a recess for violation of this policy, resulting in the immediate cessation of the audio and video recording and the council exiting the chamber. Staff will determine if the individual should be removed or if all members of the public should leave, depending on the extent of the disturbance. In the event that all public members exit, only the press would be allowed back in the meeting. Once the individual or individuals leave, the council would return to the chamber and the mayor would resume the meeting. Persons disrupting a council meeting may be cited for violation of the California Penal Code Section 403. These expectations of conduct also apply to meetings of all town boards, committees, and commissions.
Thank you. I think it's not typically on this meeting agenda, but we've got the Pledge of Allegiance here. So I will lead it if everyone can rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mayor in training. Okay, our first item on the agenda is the consent items. We have 3 items for consent. Are there any council members who would like to pull one of the consent items? Councilmember Moore.
Could I pull items 2 and 3, please?
You may. Anyone else? I'm also looking to see if there are any members of the public who would like to speak about the consent calendar and our consent items. I don't see anybody on the Zoom call and nobody in chambers, and so we will move on. And let's see. Right, so we still have one item, so I need a motion to approve. Vice Mayor Badami.
I move to approve consent item number 1.
Second, Rennie.
Okay, then we're all in person, so we can call the question by a raise of hand and sound of voice, correct? All those in favor, vote aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? No. Motion passes 5-0. So we have 2 items from the consent calendar pulled. It's our typical practice to put those at the end, and so I think we'll just follow that protocol, which then takes us to verbal communications. I don't see anybody on our Zoom call, and no one's in council chambers, so it appears we do not have any verbal communication for this meeting. So we'll move on to other business. Item 4, and it looks like we have a report from Assistant Town Manager Andrews.
Good evening, Mayor and Oversight Committee. Thank you. The item before you is a recommendation from your Finance Commission, but I'll provide a little bit of context first. You'll recall that back in 2017, this body was formed, and during the formation of this body, you also adopted an investment policy to help guide this body. You made your first revision in 2018. That revision was to define the purpose of what the 115 assets would be used for. And then you made another revision back in 2019, which made it clear that the title would change because we had no longer using the PARS firm for our 115 trust, and also making it clear that we were using the CEPPP PPT from CalPERS as our investment vehicle for the pension trust. So back in September of this year, during discussions at the Finance Commission regarding the budget, they discussed that maybe staff should come with a recommendation for a policy that would guide when we would use assets out of the OPEB trust. And so in November of this year, staff did that. What staff brought forward to the Finance Commission was a revision very similar to the one we did in 2018 to define the uses of the pension 115 trust. And so you can see the recommendation before you does 2 things to the policy. It identifies the fact that the 115 trust is the sole vehicle for holding assets for those obligations, and that the primary objective of the 115 trust is to pre-fund the town's obligations for post-employment benefits. And then finally, that funds in the 115 OPEB trust can be used for reimbursing the town for other post-employment benefits, what we refer to as pay-as-you-go, similar to what we did in this last budget year. And with that, staff is available for any questions.
Thank you. Any council members have questions for our Assistant Town Manager or any other staff? Okay, I see none. Any discussion? Do I have a motion? Because it looks like we need to adopt this.
This would be a formal adoption, yes.
Okay, thank you. Vice Mayor Badami.
Do we need to get verbal comment on this from?
I'm so sorry. So I'm opening this to the public. If there's any comments on this item, I'm not seeing anybody on the Zoom meeting. That's confirmed by the clerk, and the chambers have no members of the public, so we will close comment on this and open it for a motion. Vice Mayor Badami.
I'll go ahead and make my motion. I move to adopt proposed revisions to the Town of Los Gatos IRS Section 115 Pension Trust and other post-employment benefits, OPEB investment policy as recommended by the Finance Commission.
Thank you. Do I have a second? Councilmember Hudes?
I'll second.
Thank you. I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion passes 5-0. Now we move to item 5, and
Thank
we'll
you.
take the report. Thank you.
So staff frequently follows what happens at the investment committee at the CalPERS plan. Since we have no role really in the allocation of assets, that is really the sole responsibility of the CalPERS organization. But it does help us understand what their thinking is and how they're positioning their portfolio and what the ramifications of that could mean to us as folks that have to make annual contributions towards our benefit structure. This past year, the report is a little more interesting than usual because of some of the volatility we've been experiencing in the markets. Last year, 2021 was a very good year for markets, and we saw that flow through into the funding status that we had in both our pension and our OPEB plan. And then in 2022, the reverse happened. And so one of the highlights of the report is they basically want to let sponsors know that while it was great to see our funding in the low 80%, you can expect funding to go back to where it was, roughly 72% based on the forward returns going into 2022. One of the other areas that they bring forward is we've seen a lot of headlines lately regarding inflation and the ramifications of inflation throughout society. Well, there's ramifications to us as it relates to our pension plans also. And so they really highlight that and pull that forward, that they're watching that very closely because it could affect how they have to make potential changes to their evaluation assumptions going forward. And so you can see that they currently have an inflation assumption of about 2.3% and a payroll growth assumption of 2.8. So based on the inflation we've been experiencing, those are kind of low currently, and they're acknowledging that, and they're letting the municipalities know what it could mean going forward for contribution rates. They also then go on to talk about other things that they're watching, and they also go on to talk about what the potential ramifications of those could be. But the two main things were just letting contributors know that the plan is very susceptible to investment volatility, which we have been experiencing, and they don't necessarily see that volatility waning anytime soon. And with that, I'm available for any questions. It's not my report, but I've read it several times, and I'm happy to speak to it.
Thank you. Councilmember Hudes first, and then Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. I note that the report is prepared and recommended by Bartell Associates. I believe there's another item later tonight about Bartell. Is that correct? And so is that the legal entity that did prepare this report?
So CalPERS has several third-party actuaries on staff, including their own actuary, and then they also have multiple investment consultants, including their own investment team. And so I'm not surprised to see that Bartell may have helped in the development of this report.
Thank you. And I think that may pertain to item 5 as well, so thanks.
Correct. And item 5 of the consent calendar, correct?
Right.
Yeah. That is the same firm. Although this evening we're going to be calling them Foster and Foster after this evening.
Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. So I think in general this is relatively grim in comparison to the last year, and so I wanted to know if there's any actions we could or should be taking to kind of minimize our vulnerability.
So thank you for the question. The first high-level vulnerability is one we don't have control over, and that's the asset allocation itself. And so in that regard, we're downstream and we will have to accept the results. That being said, over the years and actually over the decades, the councils have been very proactive in addressing the liabilities associated with both our OPEB and pension. In 2009, they actually started pre-funding the liability aspect of OPEB, which was pretty progressive at the time. And by doing so, they now have a funding status on OPEB, even with the poor investment returns this past year, that is probably in the higher quartile, I'm going to say, in the state. And so in that regard, sure, we like to see better investment returns, but at least on OPEB, we're positioned much better than most of our peers. In regards to the pension plan, previous councils have done what's referred to as ADPs, or additional discretionary payments, where they made additional lump sum payments to CalPERS above and beyond our normal annual costs. They made 2 ADPs that I want to say were in the vicinity of roughly $10 million total. Those payments equate to about $12 million in interest savings down the road. And so where there's been either the budgetary wherewithal to try and do things to minimize the effect of the liabilities, councils currently and in the past have done that. And in OPEB, once again, we do have a funding status that compared to our peers is pretty good in the 70s. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Rennie.
I have a couple questions. So on page 2 of 4 in the section called Following are items of note identified in the report, in the last paragraph, it says, CalPERS has determined that required contributions may increase 5 to 12% of payroll over the next several years. Have we incorporated that into our 5-year forecast yet?
We have not yet, in the sense that they're referring to it here, because it says if current inflationary trends continue. So they haven't made this assumption yet, but CalPERS is closely watching inflation. So currently we're modeling what they have which is the inflation assumption of 2.3% and a payroll growth assumption of 2.8. So we're accepting their forward forecast, knowing that those are the variables they're using. That being said, if they do start to give indications that they are going to change it, we would move in tandem with them. But it's hard to build in an inflationary factor on our own. I mean, it's something we could ask Bartel to look at to give us a sense of the kind of magnitude that a change in those two assumptions would mean for us as an entity. That's where we use Bartel. We don't rely solely on the information CalPERS gives us. But currently, CalPERS is not making a change. They're basically throwing caution out there saying you should start thinking that if this continues, your contribution rates are going to increase.
So what that tells me is, since it's not included in our 5-year, there's some maybe significant downside risk to our 5-year forecast then? Because this is not accounted for, and they've mentioned it as a risk that might occur.
So the current forecast, we will be developing an update in the coming months. You know, we start to move through first the strategic priorities of council in January, moving into a mid-year budget review in February, and that's usually when we also develop the 5-year forecast. We should probably take a look at inflation as it relates to a lot of the elements of our forecast, not just how it relates to our pension side. Many of our contracts do have built-in inflation factors, and so those will be built in. But we could look at other areas, including our own assumption that we use for our pay raises for our employees. We do have currently a 3% COLA built for 2024 based on our agreements with our labor groups. But then after that, it's a 2% factor based on previous recommendations from the Finance Commission and Council. We may want to consider looking at that 2% factor.
So I'm trying to guess at the magnitude of the risk. So it says 5 to 12% of payroll. What numbers does that really mean for us, that we might be further in the hole, a couple 100,000, $1 million? What is that? What is the size of that?
It's a great question, and I can't really give you a good answer tonight. I would need to use Bartel to do that. I will say by far the magnitude of changes in the assumed rate of return are the biggest event that happens to us as a plan participant. When they say contributions may increase 5 to 12% of payroll, the payroll itself is a large assumption, you know, for each firm. And so depending on how Bartel views that, 5% may not be too bad, as I mentioned, as it relates to what missing a 6.8% investment return would be. But we can work with Bartel as we move through the budget process to give you a better answer.
Okay. I had a couple more, if I could keep going. There was one I was a little bit curious about. In the next section, there are, a number of bullets and the section starts with, while certain external factors are outside of the control of the system. One of the bullets talks about the use of separate 115 trust by many CalPERS agencies for minimizing the risk of required contribution spikes and volatility. And we used to have one where we were doing that, and then we came to the conclusion it wasn't really necessary. So I'm finding it interesting that they're mentioning others are having their own 115 to minimize spikes in volatility. So are we really having spikes in volatility? I'm trying to understand whether that's really necessary or not. And I think we just talked about a potential spike, but we haven't really seen spikes in volatility in what our actual payment each year is. Have we?
So thank you for the question. And we have. So for instance, last year when the plan did significantly better than the 6.8% return, our contributions did go down that CalPERS thought were necessary, and those were put in the forecast. Now, conversely, they will send us a new actuarial valuation that'll have a forecast with higher rates because of the 2022 return. So when they speak about volatility, that's what they're speaking to, is our annual, fixed contribution rate for the normal cost and our annual fixed contribution rate for the unfunded actuarial liability. So in that regard, that does ebb and flow with changes in the investment returns. You raise a good point about the 115 trust, because you might recall that when we first initiated the 115 trust, we went through an evolution of discussing what we thought would be the best possible use for the 115 trust. And so one of the things you can do for a 115 trust is the ADPs, as I mentioned. When you do ADPs, that can help you in one of two ways. If you pay off a shorter amortization base, that can give you immediate help on contributions, so it's almost like a budget strategy. If you pay off longer amortization bases, it saves you a lot of interest in the long run, and so that's more of a long-term strategy for helping to stabilize costs. Similar to what they're describing here is if you used it for short-term unanticipated changes in your budget because of spikes or changes from CalPERS, it's basically having a rainy day fund to help mitigate those budget impacts. And so we did talk through it. Ultimately, it was decided to go for the ADP approach, but having it as a rainy day fund is also a good approach.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question, if I could. Moving down to the bottom of that page 3 of 4, they say that this, it mentions, in addition, near-term forecasts forecast by investment and economic professionals suggest it may be difficult to achieve the 6.8% investment return in the near term. This potential for further increases to required employer contributions. What I was trying to figure out, is that a separate risk for additional increase in payments over the first question I asked of the 5 to 12%? So they're talking about we're going to have 5 to 12% increases, in our payroll contributions, and they mention inflation, but then they come over here, and I'm trying to make sure, is this a new risk or is this counted for in that 5 to 12% they're talking about?
I don't believe it's counted for in the 5 to 12%. So you're looking at different variables here. So in actuarial valuations, you have economic assumptions, and then you also have demographic assumptions. Demographic assumptions would be like mortality rates and things like that. On the economic assumption side, by far the driving force is the investment return, and that's what they're referencing here. They're saying that because markets are at valuation levels where they don't know if there's those types of forward returns still available, they don't know if they're going to achieve 6.8% in the short run. When we go back over here, they're talking about an economic variable where they start building what they think an inflation factor is going to be and what they think a payroll escalation factor is going to be. So they are separate factors, but they're talking about similar risks. One is the risk inflation poses, and the other is the risk that there may not be the types of future returns in the market because of where valuations are today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions right now? Okay. So I will open it to public comment, and again, the chambers are still empty, and we don't have any attendees on Zoom. Oh, we do have somebody. Would you like to speak on this issue? Thank you. Okay, we no longer have empty chambers, but we do not have public comment, so I'll close the public comment, and I'll be looking for discussion or motion. Oh, it's just a receive. Okay, so we have received it, so we will close this item and now move back to the 2 items that were pulled from the consent calendar and take those in order. So that would be item number 2. And
I'll kind of speak to them in tandem just because of the similarities.
Thank you.
So just real brief at a very high level, I mentioned earlier that in 2009, the council at the time started pre-funding, and at the time they chose the CERBT fund, which is managed through CalPERS. That fund, as you can see from the report, currently holds about $21 million in assets. And then that fund, as of October 31st, had a net return of about 3.3% for the month, but year-to-date, a minus 4.2% return. Moving on to the CEPPT, we discussed some of this already, but in 2019, the council decided that they wanted CalPERS to be the manager of their Pension 115 trust, and at the time, they chose Strategy 2 for that. You can see that fund currently has about $700,000 remaining in it. Each year, you'll recall from our general fund policy at the end of each year, there's 2 elements that will add funding to this 115 trust. One is the change of an amortization that was 30 years to 20 by doing about an additional 400,000 per year. And the other change is if there's still additional funds remaining, we do about another 300,000 a year. And so that's that 700. You can see for this plan, as of October 31st, Strategy 2 had a net return of about a 0.8% on the month, and for the fiscal year, you can see a negative 4.7% roughly. Interesting, both of those strategies had very similar negative returns, even though one has considerably more equity and the other one has considerably more fixed income. We are in a very unique environment where both fixed income and equity declined in parallel, which typically does not happen. So just an interesting aside on those two results for the year to date. And with that, we're available for any questions.
Thank you. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you. So I just wanted to get a little bit of history of why we ended up investing in, on item 2, in strategy 1 for CERBT, and then in strategy 2 for the other fund, because they're different levels of risk, and then I'll have a follow-up.
Certainly, and thank you for the question. So in strategy 1, I wasn't here in 2009, but hearing conversations over the past 5, almost 6 years, the thought was that they wanted a higher equity profile because they were trying to grow and accumulate assets over a long period of time. They knew in 2009 that they were trying to accumulate assets in the long run for OPEB, so they were comfortable, I'm assuming at the time, with the higher equity exposure that you get in the CERBT2. With the pension plan, which is more current, 2019, and they already had assets that they decided they wanted to use to pay more towards ADPs. They didn't want the extra exposure because they knew they were going to liquidate those assets to give to CalPERS. And so they went for a slightly lower risk profile on those.
That makes sense. Thank you. So just one more comment. So I'd be interested in hearing from staff in a future meeting potentially about kind of options and looking into strategies 2 and 3 and what that might look like, just knowing the kind of market situation we're going into and everything. I think it might be good to, put our money in a more conservative fund.
Thank you. And I can provide one more piece of context tonight that might be helpful for the Oversight Committee. So with OPEB, you are, as a group, the sole fiduciaries over those assets, unlike CalPERS. And so you employ Bartell to be your actuary to help you make actuarial decisions. Part of what Bartell does during their review is they actually go and see what the firms out there are putting together for capital market assumptions. They actually then take those capital market assumptions and see what different return profiles would look like, and based on that, they may or may not recommend changing the actuarial assumed rate of return. In this last actuarial review, they actually did change the return from 6.75 to 6.25, and that was based on, similar to what CalPERS is saying, they don't necessarily see the forward returns out there, so they lowered the assumption. When they moved it to 6.25, it actually aligned with the risk profile of CRBT1 because you're not alone. In the past, I know other council members have asked, should we be looking at a lower risk profile? And we were probably getting ready to do that. And then all of a sudden, everybody started dropping their expected rate of returns based on capital market assumptions. I will, when we bring the conversation forward, there's some slides from the actuarial valuation that can show if we were thinking of going to a lower risk profile, what it will mean in terms of our liability. Because if we drop the discount rate, the liability will go up. It'll change the funding status, but that might be something that this body might be willing to accept to have a lower risk profile.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further comments or questions on this item? And these were both receiving the report, and so we've received them. Thank you for the excellent report. And that concludes all of our items, so meeting is adjourned.